Hello, everyone. Tony Costa here from Toronto Apologetics. So glad that you could join us along today. And we are going to have a wonderful live stream tonight dealing with a very important topic. We're going to be talking about the Old Testament, and we're going to be talking about two of the major texts that we have the Old Testament from antiquity. We're going to be looking at the Septuagint, or the Septuagint, as some call it, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we're also going to be looking at the Hebrew text of the Old Testament and its later designation as the Masoretic Text, the MT. And so there's been a number of debate around this issue for some strange reason. Some folks are advocating the strange idea that God abandoned the Hebrew text altogether and there's no need for the Hebrew Bible, that the Greek Septuagint was the inspired version, if you will. And so there's some of these issues coming up in Christian social media, and some of them are verging on the cultic side of things. And so it gives me great honor and pleasure to invite on again my dear friend from the desert metropolis of Phoenix, Arizona, Dr. James White. How are you, James?
It is a desert metropolis. It's been really warm recently. I'm not sure if we set a new record today, but last 4 days we had, so it was like 86, 87 yesterday, something like that. It's like, come on, not yet, please. We could use a little more respite before the furnace turns back on. But yes, we are out here in the desert metropolis where I guess the world's worst named golf tournament is taking place here. I think it's this week.
Okay.
Called the Waste Management Open.
Whoa.
And I'm like, okay, I know waste management. I see their garbage trucks running around the city all the time, but seriously? And then it's become well known for the fact that pretty much everybody there is blasted out of their minds drunk. People fall into the water traps and just all sorts of wild, crazy stuff. So yeah, not exactly the greatest advertisement, aside from the fact that while other people are shivering, people are running around out here in shorts. So there is that. So
I envy them. I was in Florida for the holidays, Christmas holidays, and I loved it. And I'm so tempted to move down there. I really am, James. I really am.
Yeah. Well, wait till August comes along, and you'll be going, okay. There are advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But Phoenix. I'll be there in, and I know I'm going to miss you, James, because you're speaking, I think, at a conference or a debate. You're in a debate, I think, in April. Yeah. So I'll be down there in Phoenix with our friend George Sagg, his Ministry to Muslims. And I'll be debating Shadid Lewis. Remember our old friend Shadid Lewis?
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, he had contacted me and said he wanted me to be involved. And I'm like, well, that sounds fun. I mean, the idea of doing something in Phoenix is pretty unusual.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen Shadid Lewis in years. Hadn't heard anything about him for a long time either.
Yeah.
But I'm debating King James only guy in Livingston, Louisiana.
Okay.
And George is like, well, so that's the fourth, you could fly. And I'm like, I don't fly. It's like, what? You drive? I was like, yes. And I tried. George is so old school. I tried to send him a picture of my RV and it failed. I don't know if he just has a dumb phone or just what, but it's like, nope, can't send him pictures. Like, oh, okay. All right, fine.
Yeah. Well, he tried calling me yesterday. I was shopping and at the grocery store, and George tried calling me, and then somehow a picture snapped of him. He was shopping himself, and he just had a very miserable look about his face. But so I'll be in Phoenix and looking forward to that. And then in May, I'll be back up here in Canada in Edmonton doing a conference on Islam, and then back to the United States April. I'll be in Phoenix, and then the second week I'll be in North Carolina. I'm moderating a debate between Anthony Rogers and Shabir Ali, and this is Shabir's last debate, James. He's already said he's ready to hang his shirt. This is going to be his last debate. So I guess this is it. This is going to make history, I guess.
Well, okay. I guess he's older than I am, but I don't know how much older than I am.
Yeah, I think he's about my age. I'm 58, so I think we're around the same age.
Yeah, has he explained why?
I'm not sure. I think he told George that he's kind of moving in a different direction now. He's going to just leave debates to the side and just move in another direction, whatever that means.
Well, finding folks to debate on Islam in the United States and Canada isn't easy to do.
No.
I mean, the only debates that I've done up in Canada were with Shabir.
Yeah.
Other than Shadid and Shabir, I don't consider Nader Ahmed a Islamic apologist. So it's hard to make stuff like that happen. So
no, it is. So well, we'll see what happens, but I'm sure it'll be an interesting debate in North Carolina. Yeah, so looking forward to that, and then June I'll be in Franklin, Tennessee at the John Bunyan conference. So looking forward to that. Really, every time I go to the United States, James, I smell something different. It smells like freedom compared to up here. Up here in Canada, it is so repressive. And
well, are you sure that they're going to allow you in with all the tariff stuff and things like that? They might charge 10% of a Tony.
Thank God it's not 25%. But anyway, Trump's put that on hold for now, President Trump. And so, Canada is in a really, really bad spot right now. But anyway,
look, right now, the whole world is afraid of Donald Trump.
Oh yeah, for sure. But anyway, James, as you know, the show must go on, as they say.
Yes.
So James, I want to thank you so much for coming on, and we're going to be discussing the Septuagint and the Hebrew text of the Bible, because there's been some really weird stuff on social media, and it's coming sometimes from Reformed circles for some strange reason. But in recent weeks, we've been hearing about a confessing Lutheran that's been coming out with some very wacky ideas that Jesus did not read Isaiah 61:1 in Hebrew. He read it in Greek and so forth. But maybe what we can do is lay the groundwork for, let's talk about what exactly the Septuagint is. I'm sure some of our viewers are wondering, okay, I've heard that term, but
right.
For those who were not in seminary or college, they probably are not familiar with the phrase Septuagint. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you had said this was appearing even in Reformed circles, except that Reformed confessions are very clear on the inspiration and authority of the Hebrew text and the Greek text. Hebrew text, the Old Testament, Greek text, the New Testament. Though clearly the King James translators use the Greek Septuagint. So what we're talking about, I have here, man, I wonder when I had this bound. This had to have been sometime in the 80s. I had this made. This is it's the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, probably in a little bit earlier version, since I said the 80s. And the Greek New Testament bound together.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I had it done by a guy who's a Jehovah's Witness. One of the reasons we did it was so that we'd keep having the opportunity to talk to him and maybe witness to him. But the Hebrew text that has been used in Bible translation pretty much all along, the King James used the 1525 Blomberg text, and the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia we have today is almost word for word the same as the Blomberg text. There really has not been much in difference in all that time in the critical edition. And of course, this is a critical edition. That means there are notes indicating textual variants, because even the Masoretic Text, and the Masoretic Text, I suppose we need to define that too. In the days of Jesus, let's start from here. In the days of Jesus, what was available to the believing Jewish person? What was found in the synagogue? When I visited Israel only once, really enjoyed it. and we visited some of the old first century synagogues, and there would be next to Moses's seat, which is mentioned in Matthew 23.
Yep.
There is a box that would contain the scrolls of the scriptures. So what was available in the first century? Because one of the problems that a lot of Christians today have, I think, is we tend to look anachronistically at the past and assume that people have had the same kind of access to information that we have today. And the fact of the matter is, we live in one of the most unusual periods of time in human history.
Yep.
I mean, you and I are in different countries right now, and we're doing something live, and people around the world are watching it, and the world's just never had anything like that before. And sure, you know, I have something like this. It was made 40 years ago, but even this would have been, you know, considered a tremendous source of information by Erasmus and you know, people like that, because, you know, of all the references, footnotes to manuscripts, stuff like that. This kind of stuff is new. This draws from manuscripts in libraries all over the world. And yeah, we're used to having databases and things like that today. Hey, when you and I were in college, we had things called a card catalog.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, and I hope they keep some of them around just for the smell. You know, I think we should take kids and force them to use a card catalog to find a book in a library. That would be really, really good. But even that was a huge advancement over what had been human experience. When Erasmus, the Dutch humanist scholar in the 16th century, late 15th century, wanted to produce a Greek New Testament, he had to move. I mean, get up and move his residence to Basel, Switzerland, where he hoped that the university there would have enough manuscripts for him to be able to do his work. He moves there and is deeply disappointed in what's actually available in the library. So much so that, you know, he had to borrow a manuscript, a commentary on Revelation from a friend, Johannes Reuchlin, and it wasn't even complete. So that's what these people have been dealing with. And now, goodness, I have on my iPhone far more textual data than any generation before mine ever possessed. Yeah. It's just, and so it's hard for people to really get hold of that and realize how blessed we are. But what that means is when we look back in the days of Jesus, they had no idea and no way of understanding that the Aramaic Targums had one particular manuscript tradition behind them. You had the Hebrew text that, of course, had been preserved through God's people, which eventually, 900 years after Christ, is going to evolve into what we call the Masoretic Text. The Masoretes were scribes who came up with ingenious ways of seeking to preserve the Hebrew text. And so they would, you'd know what word was supposed to be at the top of the page, what word was supposed to be at the bottom of the page, and they had mathematical formula to figure out what's supposed to be in the middle. And the whole thing was to try to keep you from making simple errors, because everybody knew and this is the next thing. Everybody listening to this program has lived and grown up in a period of time where we have photocopiers. Okay. I use my phone now. It's amazing. You know, you just scan it, PDF it, OCR it, boom, you know, there it is. And so young people think that's always the way it's been. No, that's not been the way it's been. And in fact, all the way up until, you know, the last century, everybody, well, all the way up to the printing press, and even with the printing press, that had to be typeset, that you had to put the letters in to create the type. So there were errors, even once the printing press is created. But for all of human history, everyone has dealt with the reality that if you have handwritten texts and the only other option is something chiseled in stone, something chiseled into copper, or something like that. There were a few things like that. But if it was written down, there would be textual variation. There would be differences between the manuscripts. That's just a given.
Yeah. Every
early church father that mentions anything, there was a huge controversy in the early church, an apologetic controversy between the church and the Jews. And the Septuagint was relevant to this, about what certain texts read. And both sides would accuse the other side of altering their texts. And we find that strange because most of us figure there's an objective sort of original someplace. But you didn't have that kind of information and data at that particular point in time. And you didn't up until at least you start getting libraries put together. And then it took centuries for the libraries to start talking to each other. And yes, I have that manuscript. No, I don't have that manuscript. Things like that. Yeah. Started assigning names to them, numbers to them. So you'd have some idea what the manuscripts actually said. So, for example, Francis Turretin, brilliant theologian, made the comment that the majority of Greek manuscripts contain the Kom Johannium in 1 John 5:7. He was wrong by a long shot. It wasn't even close. But how could you know? There wasn't any way to go to a database that we can go to today. You can just pick up a printed edition of the Greek New Testament that's critical, and you've got the information right there. There's no way for him to know that. And so they would make erroneous statements because there was no way really to avoid it. So back to the first century, you have a Hebrew text, you have the Targums, Aramaic Targums, and once you have a text in one language, it's very common for that to end up being translated into other languages. And those foreign language translations can become very important, not necessarily so much in deciding, fine points of Hebrew grammar or something that may not translate into that language, but was this psalm in the Hebrew text that this language translated from, or was this word there, or is this phrase there, or something like that? So foreign language translations can be important for both the Old and New Testament, even more so for the New Testament. We could talk about that a little later. But so you've got all these different manuscript traditions that exist at the time of Christ. And you also have what's called the Greek Septuagint. And again, yes, I had this bound. I just love having things bound in nice leather and
I've got the old Brenton, the Septuagint with Apocrypha, the old published by Hendrickson. But
this is the Rolf's, just the Greek one. And of course, now on my computer, I've got the Göttingen Septuagint, which is this critical text, much more than the Rolf's. But and here's where this gets important. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament.
Right.
Now, the letter to Aristeas gives the story that, and this is the story that ended up being circulated in the early Christian church. There are many, many, many Christians who believed it to be true. Many people in the early Christian church believed that this was the authoritative version of the Old Testament. So we need to recognize that. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the Septuagint. I've got a pretty decent Septuagint library of pretty much up to date scholarship and stuff like that. You have to if you're going to be dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Muslims, whatever. You need to have the textual background of the Old Testament. A major weakness of most apologists, in my opinion. But anyway, so I've always found the Septuagint to be fascinating. But I've always recognized that the letter to Aristeas, which is what, again, was popularly believed, basically tells the story that there were 70 or 72 scholars, depends on which version you've got, that were brought together, and they were each sent into a cave or some other type of dwelling with a copy of the Torah. Now, initially, it was just the books of Moses.
Right.
But the idea was it eventually got spread out to the entire Septuagint.
Yeah.
And they all translated Moses into Greek. And when they came back out, they compared their work, and they were word for word the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, if it were true, would be a pretty strong argument that something supernatural had happened. Because no matter how good linguists are, there's a lot of differences between Greek and Hebrew.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to render all sorts of phrases that are equally accurate. So the idea of them all coming out with the exact same thing, pretty far-fetched, but that was what people believed. And then, and I think what the letter of Aristeas really does indicate to us is that the initial Greek translation was simply of the Torah, because scholars have recognized for a long, long time there isn't just one Septuagint. I mean, as far as I know, and there obviously could be some dispute about this, but as far as I know, all of the early manuscripts that we have now, some people argue about 7Q5 and Qumran and stuff like that. We can leave little things like that aside. All of the meaningfully long, useful manuscripts we have, the Greek Septuagint, came from Christians, not Jewish sources. So that obviously places them a little bit later in history, because most of the time the Septuagint is dated between 250 and 200 years before Christ.
Yeah.
The reason there's a range, of course, is we don't know. We don't have a dated copy that says this is the original or something like that. But we also recognize that there are different levels of quality in the Septuagint. It wasn't translated by the same people all at the same time. And what that means is you've got a lot of textual variation in the Greek Septuagint. You not so much in the Torah, but certainly you get into the historical books into some of the prophets. And sometimes it's spot on, and then sometimes you're like, what on earth just happened there? So for example, in Isaiah 9:6, I was talking to one of those stone choir folks on last week, and I asked them a question, and they very often, when I take on the Anon army, the anonymous people out there who won't tell you who they are, when you really push them, they just disappear. They're just gone. Which makes me wonder if they actually exist as a human being, or if it's a server farm putting out these people. I don't know.
Right.
But I asked this one guy who was pushing the idea that, this is the inspired version. I'm like, okay, would you use Isaiah 9:6 to prove the deity of Christ? We all know Isaiah 9:6. It uses the phrase El Gabor, of the coming one, the son who is given, the child that is born, the son who is given, the Prince of Peace, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, so on and so forth. Well, the Septuagint doesn't have mighty God.
Right.
It has a reference to a powerful angel.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do there? If that's the inspired version, then you shouldn't be quoting Isaiah 9:6 as having any direct relevance to the subject of the deity of Christ. So there are times you can be reading along, and in my Accordance Bible software, I'll have the Greek. I'll have the English, I'll have the Hebrew, and then I have the Septuagint. And you'll be reading along, and everything is pretty normal, and all of a sudden the Septuagint hangs a left and goes off someplace by itself for a while, and then comes back. So we don't know what manuscripts were available to the translators. It does seem that in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, that what would become the Masoretic Text 1,100 years in the future. So remember, the Masoretes are working, let's say, around 900.
Mm-hmm.
And if the Septuagint is being translated, let's say 250 BC, so you're looking at 1,150 years down the road. It's very clear that the underlying Hebrew text that becomes solidified and really because of the Masoretes frozen in the sense that given the mechanisms they use to copy it, you just couldn't have variation, which is great. That's good as long as the text you've got is as close as you can get to the original. If you do that and you have an errant text, okay, all you've done is frozen an errant text in history. That's another thing to keep in mind. So it's clear that the Masoretic, the grounding of the Masoretic text that is the basis of the Biblia Hebraicus Tucartensia, which is what is used to translate everything, ESV, NIV, NASB, they're all using the same Hebrew text. There's very, very little difference there. That it existed 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, very, very clearly. But in other places, like that text in Isaiah, well, there's a variant. There's a difference there. And it could be a very small difference. It could be a much larger difference. This also raises one of the toughest questions of New Testament interpretation and a discussion of the Greek Septuagint and Hebrew. It raises the fact that there are normally scholars would say between 85 and 90% of the citations of the Old Testament in the New Testament are derived from the Greek Septuagint. Now, there could be a really, really, really obvious basic reason for that. And that is if the majority of the New Testament is being written to non-Jewish audiences. So, Colossians, okay? Paul's writing to the church at Colossae. There might be a small synagogue there, but the vast majority of people in the church of Colossae are not Jewish. They don't read Hebrew. And if they have access to the Old Testament scriptures, what do they have access to? The Greek Septuagint. They're reading Greek thanks to Alexander the Great, basically conquering the known world. And then the Romans just basically take over the Greek Empire. And Latin starts being used, especially in the West. But in the days of Jesus and in the days of the early church, Greek was still the lingua franca. It was what everybody was speaking, including the Roman soldiers. So what else would you expect Paul to cite the Old Testament from than the Greek Septuagint? Because, the people he's writing to, that's the only language that they have. And if they have access to the scriptures, that's the version that they have. So why would he be doing a new translation from the Hebrew or something like that? It doesn't make any sense in those particular books that he's writing to primarily non-Jewish audiences. Now, you get into Matthew, and that's a whole nother discussion about its history and what it's citing from and things like that. So here's the tough question. And we should all recognize it's a tough question, and we shouldn't minimize it and try to ignore it. What happens when there's a difference between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text? Well, again, we can't engage in anachronism. Just because there's a difference between what I have here 2,000 years later does not necessarily mean that difference existed in the manuscripts that were before a writer in the New Testament. So, for example, the one I like to refer to most famous variants is in Hebrews chapter 8. So you may recall when the writer of the Hebrews quotes from Jeremiah chapter 31 about the new covenant. And he quotes, though writing to the Hebrews, he quotes from the Greek Septuagint. All the quotes in the book of Hebrews are from the Greek Septuagint. Now, again, that might be able to be explained. No, we don't know for certain who wrote Hebrews. My personal theory is that Paul preached it in Hebrew and Luke wrote it in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's Paul's theology, but it's Luke's grammar. It's Luke's vocabulary. It's Luke's style of writing.
Yeah.
There's no question. Anybody who reads Hebrews and reads Luke and Acts goes, hey, this is making sense. So it could very well be that Luke, in rendering Paul's sermon, is going to utilize, again, he's now putting it in Greek. Let's use the Greek text that is available to people.
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling something just happened with my my monitor. I have a feeling Rich is lurking in the cyber world, playing with my stuff here. So if anything goes wacky, we'll know who to blame. I blame him for everything, anyways. Now, so if I all of a sudden start turning green on your screen, then you'll know that
you're not
something weird.
Yeah, you're not turning into the Hulk or something.
You might be able to do that. I'm not sure. But yeah, I have a feeling he's playing around with stuff over there. But anyway, what was I talking about?
Yeah.
So in Hebrews 8, you have Jeremiah 31 being quoted, but most people go their entire lives, they've read Jeremiah, they've read Hebrews, and they've never stopped to notice there's a big difference between the two. It's just one phrase.
Yeah.
But if you read it in your Old Testament, it says, though I was a husband to them.
Yep.
You read it in Hebrews and it says, though I did not care for them.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of go, where did that come from? And it comes from a variant. Now, when we look at the Hebrew manuscripts, we have Hebrew manuscripts that have a textual variant in them.
Yeah. And
it's the difference between Baal. You've heard the term the Baals.
Yes.
That's actually Baal in Hebrew.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Baal means Lord.
Yep.
And hence husband.
Yeah.
So there were manuscripts that had Baal, but there are manuscripts that have Gaal with a G sound, the Gimel.
The Gimel.
Gimel and Bet aren't identical, but they're fairly close to each other in shape.
Mm-hmm.
And Gaal means to despise or dislike.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only a one-letter difference in the manuscripts, but it comes across. And so you can get a sense of what manuscripts may have been being used as the exemplars that were being translated into the Greek Septuagint. But again, since the Septuagint wasn't done by a single translator at a single time in a single place, there may be sections of the Septuagint that were translated by someone that had access to one kind of one strain of the Masoretic text, or what would become the Masoretic text, and then somebody else might have had another, because there are variants even in the Masoretic tradition. There are manuscripts that differ from one another. So all of this is not normally the substance of sermons, not normally the substance of Bible studies. And in fact, you've probably experienced the same thing I have, but I've been criticized at times for talking about stuff that bothers people.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
I get that all the time. Yeah.
No, not saying that what you say bothers people. No, but addressing topics that, Brother White, after you spoke at our church, Mrs. Finkelmeyer in the back was very upset, and we're very dependent upon her husband was very wealthy, and we're dependent upon her giving, so we're never having you back again. That kind of thing. But it's seriously true. It's true that there are certain subjects that don't get talked about because you're talking about things not only that are somewhat, we're having to explain all of our terminology here, and we're having to talk about this manuscript tradition, that manuscript tradition, but people just would rather, most people, and I've given this presentation hundreds of times over the years on the New Testament reliability, but you could do it on the Old Testament as well. I've asked people, how many of you in here wish that there were not notes on the side of your page or the bottom of your page that say things like, some manuscripts do not contain this verse, or some manuscripts read like this, or something like that? And I'll have a bunch of people, I have a third of the people in the audience who will be honest enough and put their hand up and go, yeah, I don't really like that. That means that most of our people really struggle with this kind of stuff.
Yep.
And I'm even thinking that Rich is now changing the camera angle. Did my camera angle change?
No, it hasn't, but it's gotten brighter.
Yeah. Let me do something here.
There you go. Now you've changed. Oh, there we go. Now you're in the center.
Okay, you know what? Okay. I can't even see it. So Rich is definitely trying to play with me, and I'm not sure why this is. I can't even tell which camera I'm supposed to be on right now. Because he's changed what's on the screen, so I can't see this stuff anymore.
If you're looking straight ahead, James, you're good.
I'll look between them. Anyway, so this stuff is, and I'm not saying, well, look, we should get to talk about whatever we want to talk about at any time. No, I'm not saying that. I know. I remember I did a textual criticism class in Kyiv, Ukraine, a number of years ago.
Oh yeah.
And I had a pastor who had graduated from the school.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the class, through the translator, he said, I'm really thankful to have learned all this stuff, but you have to understand, I could never explain this to my people. I could never even raise this and talk to my people.
Right.
And part of that is because they in Russian and Ukraine, they really have a very limited number of translations. Did you know that the standard Russian translation, the Synodal Bible that they have, does not indicate the Tetragrammaton, the Old Testament? They have no idea that it's there.
Wow.
There is nothing in the font, anything even gives them when I would explain that to classes. I taught a class in Samara, Russia in 2019.
Nice.
It was in January. It's 28 degrees below zero.
Oh, yeah.
When I tried to explain that to the class, and the looks on everybody's faces was like, they're just looking at their Bible and looking at me. Because I'm talking about evidences of the deity of Christ, where Jesus identified as Yahweh. They've got none of that in their translation.
Yeah.
It's not there. They have no way of knowing when the Tetragrammaton is being used.
Right.
So that just gives you an idea. Here's a pastor. He was very thankful for what I said, but he's like, I'm glad I know this, but there ain't no way that I could explain this to my people,
right,
without absolutely freaking them out.
Right.
And so, that's hard, because some of this stuff is really foundational to how you defend the accuracy of the transmission of the text of Scripture over time.
Yeah.
And so coming back here to the United States, it might be a little bit easier for us, but still, I do meet resistance in even talking about these kinds of things. The problem is our enemies know all about it.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know why I just thought of this, but it's because my mind's going, I suppose. But don't worry, I know you're younger than I am. You'll catch up. It's after 60. Just give it up.
Downhill from there, baby.
It's not downhill. It is out and you don't even have a parachute. It's just straight out the back of the plane, and you're
headlong.
You're heading straight down. Right. But I remember very clearly doing a radio program. I think I was debating a guy named Van Hale. Does that name ring any bells?
It does.
Okay. He hasn't really been doing much.
Not Van Halen. Not Van Halen.
Not Van Halen. James White debates Van Halen. News at 11. Yeah. No. Van Hale was a LDS apologist.
Yeah.
And back in the 80s and 90s, I would do either on the phone, or actually when I would go up to Salt Lake City for the general conference, we'd go into the studio, KTKK and some of the other little radio stations in the Salt Lake Valley.
Right.
And, it would be me versus him. Or once I did one, me versus Martin Tanner, LDS attorney, as the host, and 2 professors from BYU taking calls in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I remember that.
Talk about being outnumbered.
Walter Martin, I think, debated Van Hale as well.
He did. That was where I first heard of Van Hale. And then he came to Phoenix. I was still really young. I was probably I was definitely in my 20s, first time we encountered each other. That's how long ago it was on a secular radio station. You should have seen the secular radio host. Once we started getting into all this stuff about the Book of Abraham and stuff like that, he looked like he just wanted to curl up and die. But he thought, hey, I'm not having to interrupt, so let them do their thing. Who cares? Yeah. So anyway, I think I was on with Van Hale from my office in Rich Pierce's I think it was in his garage at the time. Right. It might have been in one of the bedrooms of his house. I don't remember, but it was late at night, and it was the textual variant in Psalm 45 he was throwing out, and it was based upon the Greek Septuagint. So they know, and your sharper Muslims, now Nader Ahmed, no, but Shabir Ali will raise issues about the Septuagint versus the Hebrew text and stuff like that. He will do that. And there are some others that might be familiar enough to raise that kind of stuff. So the opponents of the faith know this stuff, and that's why I say we have to talk about it. We have to recognize that these variants exist, and we have to then at least familiarize ourselves with the answers that have been given. So, in light of that, it should be noted that the Eastern Orthodox have a very high view of the Greek Septuagint.
Yes.
And many of them did jump in on that recent conversation and support Corey Mahler's comments about the Christian scriptures being only in Greek. So I'm not honestly certain what the current standard view again, who speaks for Eastern Orthodoxy today anyways? I mean, with what happened between Ukraine and Russia, and there's a liberal orthodoxy developing in Greece and places like that so I'm not really sure who speaks for it any longer. So who could say? But there does seem to be a predilection for the Greek Septuagint over the Hebrew Masoretic Text amongst the Eastern Orthodox. And you can understand why. I mean, they're the ones maintaining the Greek language in their liturgy and things like that. And so, why wouldn't you do that?
Right.
So you may encounter some of that and some of those arguments from the Eastern Orthodox. And then when it comes to the Old Testament, the internet and social media has produced enough Hebrew roots insanity to fill volumes. I mean, if there's anything you want to prove from the Old Testament scriptures, you can find somebody somewhere in the shapes of the letters or the numbers. And I'd be really interested in knowing if Shabir still does the magic number 19 in the Quran argument.
I think he still does.
I think he does too. So there's just so much stuff out there that I can understand why a believing Christian could be really confused if they do almost any kind of web search. They're gonna come across everything. They really are. But you specifically brought up the stuff with Corey Mahler, and so it probably would be good to look at some of that, because there's a situation where you have what I've identified to be a I just saw a note from Rich, and I was right. He was in there playing around. I'm sure he was just trying to make things look better.
Yeah. Yeah.
He can't leave well enough alone. He just tinkers. Anyway, I have identified. I first heard of the Stone Choir webcast, I don't know, about a year and a half ago. I remember looking it up, sort of looking at it, and since I didn't stop to dig in and didn't really have any background, I was like, okay, I don't know why anyone's talking about this, and I moved on. What we have is really, in my opinion, the current genesis of a cult. So I've likened it to E.D. Howe dealing with Mormonism. He wrote the first anti-Mormon book in 1834-35 called Mormonism Unveiled. I mean, he would have been writing it in 34 and then published it in 35. And so we're looking at that kind of a situation right here. You have now you said confessing, but excommunicated.
Okay.
Lutheran. Yeah. The video of his excommunication is available on Twitter.
Wow.
Where the charges are read out. Basically, hatred of humanity.
Whoa, wow.
That's a pretty broad one, but and from a conservative Lutheran church, LCMS.
So
we're not talking about the wacko, ELCA stuff.
Yeah, everything Luther can't affirm. ELCA. Everything Luther can't affirm.
I had never heard that before. Yeah. That's good. Everything Luther cannot affirm. That's good. That's good. So is conservative Chris Rosebaum, he's been going after Corey Mahler, and he's been dealing with these people a lot longer than I have. I finally got in touch with him and said, bro, could you leave the word mystery out and fill me in on the rest of it? and have you ever been to it? I'm trying to think. I have this recollection that we may have spoken at a conference where you and I were there, and Chris was too.
Okay, I can't.
May have been in Canada.
No, I can't recall that.
Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, it's been years since we've been at the same place, and I got a hold of him, and he filled me in on the background of this stuff, and so we have a cult starting here, and. I forget you had a screen. You showed it to me before we got started.
I'll bring that up.
Where I had, I'm trying because see, he's already responding to me there at the bottom. The Hebrew, of course, has no vowels. So host Eleuthero, that's my Twitter handle, was assuming that he knows. So that was already into, I forget what actually triggered this particular exchange, because I had not said anything to him. He came after me about something that I had said. I don't remember, because I remember coming home from church. I think I came home from church, and here was this big thing from Corey Mahler going after me. And that's what started all this. But I know one of these, and I saw that you did have it. One of these was where I said cult leaders doing cult things or something
right here.
Yeah, cult leaders doing cult things.
Yeah.
And this is where I had put up two texts, Deuteronomy 4:35 and Jeremiah 10:10, that specifically identify Yahweh as God.
Right here. Yep.
And of course, I was I had the opportunity the first time this past Christmas, just a few weeks ago, to go out to the Christmas lights presentation at the LDS Temple in Mesa, Arizona. They've done it for years. I've just never done the Christmas lights thing. I would do the Easter pageant, but so weird. I had never done that. This time I got to go out. My grandkids were out there. My oldest is 15, so they get to do all sorts of fun stuff like that. And so we were out there, and I was pointing to the building that used to be the visitors center that they've moved it across the street now. I said, I got kicked out of that building for showing missionaries Deuteronomy 4:35, which you have on the screen there.
Yes.
And they're like, why? Because it says, to you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh, which they mispronounce as Jehovah, he is Elohim. Yes. There is none other besides him.
That's right.
And in fact, if you're looking at the Hebrew, it's Ha Elohim. It has the article
right here.
He is God.
Elohim.
And so in Mormonism, of course, Jehovah is the offspring of Elohim, at least since 1901, when the first presidency defined this stuff. There have been lots of Mormon scholars that have, I think, pretty much proven that wasn't Joseph Smith's view. Joseph Smith hadn't developed that level of specificity. But the first presidency put out a statement, I think it was 1901, specifically identifying the Father as Elohim and Jesus as Jehovah.
Right.
And so that's why I got kicked out of the visitor center, was for showing them what Deuteronomy 4:35 actually
You know what,
states.
James? Up here in Canada, in north of Toronto, there's a city called Brampton or Bramalea, and the Mormons opened it up in the early 90s up here. And I went in there with a couple of my apologist friends, and we got to I went through the whole thing. Like, I mean, I saw where they seal marriages for time and eternity.
This is the temple you're talking about. This is the temple before the dedication. Right.
Yeah. And so they let all the Gentiles in before they consecrated it. And so I got to see the big baptistry with the 12 oxen.
Did you have to wear booties?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know why they do that?
Yeah, because we're unclean.
We're unclean. And what they used to do before they came up with the booty idea was rip the carpet out and relay it. That's expensive and time consuming.
Very expensive. So I felt like I was going into surgery with those little booties on. And so anyway, I went through there, and then during the Q&A, there was a number of black folks there. And so I brought up the issue of the blacks and Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. And I didn't know this. They had Mormon security. They escorted me out of the temple. They literally escorted me out. And I was just saying, in the name of Jesus Christ, the Book of Mormon's a fraud. Joseph Smith was a false prophet.
Well, that'll get you kicked out.
But I was saying that while they're carrying me out.
Carrying you out.
Yeah. So
obviously everybody knows that I am so much nicer than Tony Costa. Everybody everybody says that to me all the time. Actually, no one's ever said that to me. Actually, no one has ever said anything about me being nicer than anyone. So I need to be honest about that. But when I went through the Manhattan Temple, most people don't even know there's one there, because the Manhattan Temple, to my knowledge, I think there's one in like Hong Kong that may be the same thing. But there's no place to build a building in Manhattan. Everything's already taken. So it's one of the few LDS temples that's actually in another building. It's floors in a particular building. Very unusual.
Weird. Yeah.
And so I got the opportunity of touring that one. And instead of being carried out like you were, I got done with the tour, and then they took you into this room where they served water and chocolate chip cookies. Now, I don't expect them to give you coffee. I get the word of wisdom. I understand.
Yeah.
But water and chocolate chip cookies? I mean, that was weird. They were decent cookies anyways. And so they had missionaries walking around, and if you looked like you were bored or you might want to talk, they'd sit down. And so I took the opportunity at that point in time to do my testifying at that point. But I never got kicked out. So, I'm obviously... Now, I was kicked out of the Missionary Training Center in Provo, Utah. I was kicked out by President Bishop.
Wow.
And this would have been about 1985 or 6.
Okay.
I had driven there in a 1964 Dodge Dart that had no two body panels that were the same color.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, seen those. Yeah.
The olden days, man. I'm driving a beautiful GMC truck now. I'm pulling my RV, but man, you had to earn that, and I did. How did we get onto this? Oh my goodness!
No, we got off into Mormon. Oh yeah, because you're talking about Yahweh.
Deuteronomy 4:35. Yeah.
Talking about Yahweh and Elohim. But,
so somehow Mahler had made this statement, and you do have it somewhere in one of the screens there. It's real small. I can't read it, but had right there.
Yeah, I can read it out, James. The Lord God, whose name is most certainly not the demon Yahweh, rank Judaizing is a sure mark of the apostate. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. So if you disagree with Mahler about almost anything, you are a rank Judaizer.
Right.
So and of course, for you and I, Judaizer has a very specific meaning that's historically defined primarily by the book of Galatians and stuff like that. But when you're starting your own cult, you get to do whatever you pretty much want to, and that's what Corey Mahler's doing.
Yeah.
But here you have this, and I'm wondering now, especially since we're talking about it, I had a guy come up to me at church about a year ago and asked me, "Have you ever heard anyone saying that Yahweh is a demon?" And I wonder if it wasn't coming from Stone Choir all the way back then. At the time, I was like, well, the Gnostics, certainly the Gnostics identified Yahweh as Yaldabaoth.
Yes.
In the Gnostic pantheon, who was an abortion, basically. I mean, he was
the demiurge.
It's a demiurge, but it was because Sophia contemplated in a way she wasn't supposed to do outside of her consort, the male consort. She's the female, so she has this malformed offspring that has supernatural powers, but doesn't understand the pleroma and all the rest of this stuff. And and again, let's be honest with you, the vast majority of seminary graduates have no earthly idea what Gnosticism was actually all about. No. They've only got a vague dualistic idea, but they've never read the Apocryphon of John or anything like that. They don't know the difference between Valentinian Gnosticism and the more standard forms and all the Yaldabaoth. I mean, what is that? So people get away with stuff, and so my answer to the guy was, sounds like some kind of Gnostic weirdness. I'm wondering now if he hadn't already run into some of the Stone Choir stuff before I did. A lot of people run into stuff before I do these days. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that's out there now, and that we have to be responding to. And most folks are just trying to live the Christian life, take care of their kids, their wife, their husband, their parents, whatever it might be. They don't care about what's going on social media until it invades the church.
Yes.
And that's what's going on here.
Right.
And so what Mahler's talking about is, and you have some screens here that I think you're going to show, is how do you deal with the Hebrew Tetragrammaton if you're translating it from Hebrew into another language? Mahler's idea is, and I think this is simply because he's an anti-Semite. He promotes not only white supremacy, but all sorts of just, the people have collected stuff that he has said about the Jews, Judaism, so on and so forth. It's truly disgusting, and it's Nazi-esque. It really is. But I think he has that personal animus toward anything that's Jewish. And of course, Marcion had the same animus in the 2nd century, and hence basically got rid of the Old Testament, got rid of anything positive toward the Jews in the New Testament, and in a way helped to trigger more serious thought about the canon on the part of the church.
Yes.
When you get that kind of heresy, it's like, well, wait a minute, we need to think this through. So I think it's the same kind of animus on the part of Mahler. But his idea is, all right, you have Yod Hey Wow Hey. Now, I had in fact, tomorrow night, is it tomorrow night? What's Wednesday? Yeah, tomorrow night, we have a dinner, and it's a bunch of old people. I'm the youngest person, but I'm old anyways. So I'm the youngest person in this group. We have the Society of St. Martin. Now, what in the world is that? One of my professors at Grand Canyon College, when I started attending there in 1982, was Dr. D.C. Martin.
Oh, yeah.
And D.C., wow, what a fantastic teacher. As I look at how I've developed as a professor over the years, I learned so much from him. And he was just such a good communicator and a good man. He died of lung cancer in the 90s. And we get together, those of us who knew him, on his birthday. And we eat at one of his favorite Mexican restaurants, and we swap stories about D.C. Martin. And but he was one of the people that helped me to understand these issues. He was an Old Testament scholar. And so he would, talk about pronunciation. And I don't think he was nearly as conservative as I am, actually, in thinking back on some of the comments that he made. Either that, or he was just trying to see who was listening.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. But so from the start of my education outside of high school, I was already dealing with issues like this from DC Martin and things like that. And so how he told the story, and this is what's humorous about it. Since he read Hebrew, he was invited to, he went to a synagogue locally, and he was invited to read the Hebrew text. And he forgot something. When he would read the Hebrew text, he would just read the Hebrew text. But as you know, there are certain words you don't say in the synagogue.
Right.
And so he was reading, and he encounters the Tetragrammaton. And Tetragrammaton is Yod Hey Waw Hey. It's 4-letter covenant name of God. So it was right there. In fact, it's right on the screen right now.
Yep. It's right
Jeremiah
up here,
10:10.
right up here.
Yahweh is the true God. So you can see that first, and that's not, doesn't show up in mine, but the first word, and it's not, remember, Hebrew is written from right to left. So the first word there in Jeremiah 10:10 in the Hebrew is Yahweh.
Yep.
Yahweh Elohim Emeth. Yahweh is the true God.
Yep.
So I don't think he was reading Jeremiah 10:10, but if he was, he said Yahweh Elohim. He said Yahweh Elohim Emeth.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, because
blasphemy. Stone him.
Blasphemy.
Stone him. Stone him.
Stone him. Because you don't say the divine name in Judaism.
Right.
And the way that you either say Hashem, the name, or you say Adonai.
Right.
And so what they did is, and it's too small for me to see really well here, but they've placed the standard vowel pointing for Adonai under Yahweh. But think about it. Yahweh is a 2-syllable word. Adonai is a 3-syllable word. So it doesn't actually work, but it's purposeful. It's a warning sign. Do not say this word. This is the divine name.
Right.
Say either Hashem or Adonai. And DC Martin forgot about that. And I'm sure he told the whole class that. I was probably the only person in the class that found it fascinating, interesting, remembered it 50 years later, and things like that. But that is, we don't have an MP3 recording of someone saying Yahweh. We don't have Moses, saying Yahweh when it's first utilized in the Old Testament. And so that's the same word that is transliterated as Jehovah.
Yeah.
Jehovah comes actually more from Adonai. Jehovah has become a 3-syllable word rather than the 2-syllable word that it's actually translating. There wasn't a J sound.
Right.
Yes, I've seen the long verbose articles by Jehovah's Witnesses online trying to defend Jehovah and all the rest of that stuff. But the vast majority of scholars who aren't trying to sell books or aren't in a cult or whatever else it is will say, look, given the letters and given the relationship possibly to the verb that means to be, haya, in all probability, the pronunciation would have been Yahweh.
Right.
And so, the Legacy Standard Bible has come out and uses Yahweh. And for years, when I used the New American Standard, whenever I'd see LORD in all caps, small font, the English Bible's translator's way of saying this is the Tetragrammaton, I'd read Yahweh. So that's one of the reasons I use Legacy Standard when I'm using an English translation now. So here's the point. When you're reading the Hebrew, you can see the Tetragrammaton. You know this is God's covenant name.
Yeah.
When you're reading the Septuagint, what did they do? Well, good question. because the vast majority of Greek manuscripts that we have come from Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And in the majority of them,
Yeah.
they didn't really translate it. They rendered it with the Greek term kurios,
Right.
which means Lord.
Yeah.
Well, there is a perfectly good Hebrew word which means Lord.
Yeah.
Adonai, Adoni, depending on how it's vowel pointed. Adon, that means Lord. So there are places where you have Lord Yahweh, which would become kurios, kurios.
Yeah.
It really wouldn't make much sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the translators were struggling with what to do with the divine name, how to render it in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the significant things about this, leaving the stone choir cult out, one of the significant things about this is there are a number of texts in the New Testament. Are you looking for that one that you have?
Is this the one?
No, you're showing me the manuscripts that had different ways of putting that.
Yeah. So if we look at the manuscripts, so I was just this is from Revelation 19, and I've just highlighted just to show our viewers, James, that the Greek transliteration hallelujah comes from, as you know, from the Hebrew hallel, to praise, Yah, which is sometimes called the Diagrammaton, because it's made up of the first two letters of the Tetragrammaton, Yod Hey. So this is a Greek transliteration. This only appears in Revelation, by the way, in the New Testament, the Alleluia here. And so they're transliterating, John here is transliterating the Hebrew hallelujah into Greek here.
Right.
And so the Yah there at the end corresponds to the divine name Yahweh.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you had some manuscripts.
Yeah. And so if we look at, this is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which shows, isn't it interesting, James, that the Jews in Qumran, they held the Hebrew text, they had the Septuagint there, the Greek text, and they had Aramaic as well. So they had the three languages that we have in our Bible, the three human languages God used. And so this is Leviticus 4:27, this 4Q120. This is 1st century BC. And in that purple square there, or blue square rather, you have there the three letters, the iota, the alpha, the omega, and it's trying to pronounce the divine name as Yahweh.
Right.
And so what this shows us is that the Jews in Qumran, at least in this portion of the Septuagint from Leviticus 4:27, they're actually writing out the sound of the Tetragrammaton.
Right. And so for folks to have a little bit more background on this, whenever I show fragments like this, some people are like, man, why is that in such bad shape? And my response always is, well, if what are you going to look like 1,800 years from now? I mean, these are it amazes me that there's any papyrus that is this old.
Yeah.
I mean, my seminary textbooks are turning yellow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
So, and then and that's very nice. That's actually rather good handwriting. I mean, that looks almost like Sinaiticus in some places. It's very well done. And the 4Q120, just in passing here, so people might be able to connect this to something else that's going on. I just did a Apologia Radio episode last week,
right,
with Jeff and Zach, and we were talking about the controversy that came up because Wes Huff, what he said to Joe Rogan, and then people have been attacking him, and that atheist fellow was attacking him, and so we took the time to talk a little bit about the character of 1Q Isaiah A, which is the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran.
Yes.
And so when you see an indication like this, it says 4Q120.
Yeah.
So this is from the 4th Qumran cave,
right?
Fragment 120.
Correct.
So they had to develop some kind of a nomenclature to be able to identify fragments. And so earlier, just in passing, and I knew Tony knew about this, but I mentioned 7Q5, which is the fifth fragment from the seventh Qumran cave,
right,
which is so tiny, but it's in Greek. And years ago, the theory was put forward, and there's still some people I'm sure who believe it. The book was interesting that presented the theory, but it's such a small fragment, it has to remain a theory. There's just not enough of it to be able to prove it. But the theory was that this fragment was from the Gospel of Mark.
Right. That's right.
Which I guess what would be really fascinating about that would be that would have to mean that Mark was early. Very early. Like 40s at the latest, because the Qumran community's pretty much gone by the time Titus and Roman legions come through to go wipe out Masada. So when you see references to the Dead Sea Scrolls in general, you'll see these Qs, and that 4Q, 1Q, 7Q is an identification of the cave in which it was found. So I think that's important for folks to be aware of.
It's also interesting, isn't it, James, that the Septuagint was held by these Jews in Qumran. I mean, they had a Greek translation, obviously, here of Leviticus.
Right.
But it's interesting that, this goes right against what Corey was saying, that the name Yahweh is a demon, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have proof from Qumran that in the Greek translation, instead of Yahweh or the Lord, they could have used Hakurios here, but they didn't. They wrote it in such a way that they were trying to pronounce the Tetragrammaton, and so this goes against what Corey was trying to say there. And of course, I showed this to you as well, James. This is Paleo Hebrew. In the yellow boxes there, folks. What you're seeing there is, again, the Septuagint. It's a Greek translation. And the Tetragrammaton is written in, those are Paleo Hebrew letters, meaning Old Hebrew form. And it's the Yod He Vav He or Yod He Wav He. So here again, there are these Jews who are writing this and trying to use the name of God in such a reverential manner that they'll keep it in Hebrew rather than translate it into Kurios.
Yeah, that Paleo Hebrew is fascinating. It's actually rather beautiful.
It is. I love it.
It really is. I wouldn't be able to read it, but I've actually looked at it enough to have some artwork done based on it. It's fascinating stuff. By the way, I was putting my old man reading glasses on, and I grabbed my Septuagint here, and just verifying that all the commandments of Kuriu is what is in the Rolf's Septuagint. At that place right there. So you see the word right before, it's got a little bit of damage to it. The tau's missing. But the entalon Kuriu is there.
Yeah, you can clearly see it there. Entalon, the commandments of Yahweh. Yeah, so absolutely. So the Paleo Hebrew is there, and as well, James, that there were other Jews who wrote in Greek, like Theodotion. We have also Aquila and Symmachus, and so there are at least three different texts of the Old Testament that these Jews tried to translate into Greek as well. So, as you said, there were various streams of the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Right, and that's what people struggle with a little bit, is they don't like the idea that there were, again, different manuscript traditions that existed in that day. But you just need to understand that that's the way things were throughout human history. And by the way, I should mention to folks, if you want to delve into this stuff, I haven't seen too many books that try to make this understandable without using the original languages.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, it's almost impossible to do that without using the original languages. But Emmanuel Tove is the name. I mean,
he's the go-to.
He's the go-to guy when it comes to Old Testament textual criticism, the state of the text in Second Temple Judaism, stuff like that. And he does have some general introduction, but still, even the general introduction is challenging to read. It's really not meant to make that understandable to most folks. So, but it is there if you want to delve into that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think I have that book somewhere here. What I was going to suggest to the viewers is there's some helpful books. There's this one here. I don't know if you've seen this one, James.
Yes.
The Septuagint by Gregory Lanier and William Ross, and published by Crossway. So it's a small book, but it's very helpful if you want to know a little bit more about the Septuagint. And of course, James, our all-time favorite, of course, the Roger Beckwith's The Old Testament Canon of the New Testament Church. This is a great book on the canonicity of the Old Testament, and Dr. Beckwith, of course, argues that the Apocrypha was not part of the canon of the Hebrew people of the Old Testament. And his famous statement, James, that he talks about the books that were laid up in the temple. He uses that formal language and how the sacred texts make the hands unclean and so forth. So this is a superb book, very well documented. I would highly recommend Roger Beckwith.
I'm hoping that I had a little something to do with this being republished, because I had encountered it in my preparations for my debate with Jerry Matitix at Boston College in 1993.
Okay.
And it was I think it was out of print by then, or went out of print shortly thereafter. And I was like, oh man, this thing has got to, this has got to remain.
This is 85, James. This is 1985. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's been around a while, and I know that some of the Catholic apologists have tried to take shots at it and try to take it apart, but it's hard to go after Beckwith. He was a tremendous scholar, died last year. But we're very thankful for the work that he did. And I'm really thankful for an article he wrote on the dating of the incarnation.
Yeah. I like that one.
Yeah.
That was very
that's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Well, there's another one I was going to just share. This is the last one, James. This is interesting. This is a minuscule, as you can see from the writing, and 11th century AD. And what they do here is this is Psalm 80 verse 4, which in the Septuagint is 79 verse 5. That's because they merge 9 and 10, Psalms 9 and 10 together. And there you'll notice, folks, there's the minuscule Greek text there. And then they add this pi iota. And they do that to make those Greek letters resemble the Tetragrammaton, even though the first letter is a yod, right, James? It's yod he vav he,
right? But
they're trying to mimic, if you will, mirror the Tetragrammaton. So it's quite interesting that even in the 11th century AD, you find this type of writing that tries to appeal to the place of the Tetragrammaton.
Yeah, and it's good that people know that this has been a challenge all along. I think Christians should be able to recognize if your English translation isn't like the LSB and it doesn't render it, you should be able to recognize the LORD in all caps. Yeah. The O and the R and the D are in capital form, but they're a smaller font size. Yeah. So in the New American Standard, most English translations, there have been others that have used Jehovah or Yahweh. They're not the most popular amongst conservatives. The LSB is the first one really along those lines.
You got the Jerusalem Bible, but that's a Roman Catholic translation.
Right. And you need to be able to recognize those things, because there are so many important texts that identify Jesus as Yahweh that you're not going to see if you can't go back to the Old Testament and recognize the presence of the Tetragrammaton there. You're just not going to be able to do it. And of course, this demonstrates that Corey Mahler certainly isn't going out and witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses,
No.
or anybody else like that, or anybody at all, because his perspective, if he's literally saying that God destroyed the Hebrew language, okay, so when was the Pentateuch inspired, and in what language? Because it existed for over a millennium before the Greek Septuagint was translated.
Right.
So were the Greek translators translating an uninspired text, but what they produced became inspired? So was there, what did inspiration not, maybe, actually, now that I'm sitting here thinking about it, I have to wonder if they wouldn't theorize that God would not inspire Jews because they're very anti-Jewish. The problem is, it was clearly Jews who did the translation.
That's right.
Into Greek.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it is interesting to note, you were looking at one of the things. The Jews do move away from the Greek Septuagint.
Yes, eventually, yes.
Eventually, and now Qumran they don't, because why would they? That this is all prior to Christ.
Right.
But because the early church grabbed hold of the Septuagint and looked at it with such reverence, that's why we see as early as Justin Martyr and his dialogue with Trypho.
Yes.
You're already getting the argumentation about text.
Yes.
By the middle of the 2nd century.
Yep.
And so that's why I said, when it comes to meaningfully sized Septuagint manuscripts, an entire book or something like that, they're all from Christians. We have fragments from Qumran, but when it comes to what we use to produce, the Septuagint text that we use today, those manuscripts all came from Christians, and the Jews moved away from that. And that's why Anthony Buzzard is wrong about Psalm 110. Yeah. And what do I mean by that? Well, Anthony Buzzard tries to argue that if you look at the Masoretic text, the term is Adoni in Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Adoni is never used of a divine figure. It's of a human being, and therefore Jesus has to be just a human being. And of course, where did Adoni come from? The consonantal text is identical between Adoni and Adonai. Right. The vowel pointing was provided by the Masoretes 900 years after Christ. Right. And by then, they fully knew. They knew by 300 years after Christ that the Christians used Psalm 110 as a key messianic text. Absolutely. And so all Anthony Buzzard is doing is proving that the Masoretes rejected the deity of Christ. Well, there's a revelation no one had ever had before. Yeah. It's interesting, James, because when the rabbis later rejected the Septuagint because the Christians were using it. Right. And one rabbi actually said the day that the Septuagint was created, it was equal to the day when Israel built the golden calf in the wilderness. So they were just decrying it, and yet it was their ancestors who wrote it. Like, they're the ones who translated it into Greek, and it makes sense, doesn't it, James? I mean, you got these Jews in the diaspora. They're out in Egypt and Alexandria. They're all over the world, and they don't know Hebrew. Just like, I come from a Portuguese background, and my kids they try to speak Portuguese. It's like Pig Latin. I mean, you just forget your mother tongue. And so it made sense why the Jews had their scriptures in their lingua franca, because even Luke points out in Acts 6:1 that there was a dispute between the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebrew-speaking Jews over the widows, and then they created the office of the deacons. So yeah. Just one quick question, James. Then we'll just take a few questions from our audience. You often hear people say, "Well, the Septuagint had the Apocrypha, and the Septuagint, the Alexandrian canon, was different from the so-called Palestinian canon." And I find it very interesting that when I read Philo of Alexandria, and I pressed Trent Horn on this once on a social correspondence, James, Philo of Alexandria, as far as I can tell, never ever quoted from any of the books of the Apocrypha. And I pressed Trent Horn on this, and he agreed with me that, well, he says, well, that's an argument from silence. I says, but really? I mean, Philo doesn't quote once from Judith or from Wisdom or from First Maccabees, Second Maccabees.
I think Philo's silence, I think, says a lot there.
Well, and of course Beckwith expanded on that and made the argument that the standard thing that I was taught in seminary, the standard idea that there was a Palestinian canon and that there was an Alexandrian canon.
Yeah.
He disputed that and said, no, there's no evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
The Alexandrians knew what the Jews in Jerusalem knew,
Mm-hmm.
and that was that these books did not claim inspiration. They were self-contradictory. They weren't even, most of them were not even written in Hebrew to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so he disputed that idea that there was that distinction between the canons. And yes, once you get into the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, then you have a standardized text of the Septuagint that has been produced within Christian context. And by the way, the translation of the Deuterocanonicals or apocryphal books is some of the worst in the Septuagint, which plainly shows that it came long after the translation of the Pentateuch and things like that. It's on a very different level. But that was one of the main reasons that Jerome and Augustine argued over the Old Testament canon, is that Jerome knew that the Jews did not accept those books. Mm-hmm. But Augustine, reading the Septuagint, not having access to the Hebrew, thought that those books were a part of the Jewish canon.
Right.
Because they were in the Septuagint. Mm-hmm. And he was wrong about that.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, folks, we're just going to take some questions from our audience. And if you have any questions, please put a Q in front of the question. Thanks, Born Again, for that super chat. Question: when New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it reads closer to the Septuagint than the Masoretic Text. Doesn't it just mean it is quoting Greek translation of the pre-Christian Hebrew Bible? I would say yes. It is a Greek translation of the pre-Christian Hebrew Bible, and for reasons I think Dr. White already mentioned, most of these New Testament texts were being addressed to a Greek audience, and even Jews in the diaspora, they didn't know Hebrew, so they would have quoted from a pre-Christian Hebrew Bible that was translated into Greek.
The only and we didn't get into this, and it would take us too long to get into it, because it is, in my opinion, probably one of the most challenging hermeneutical and exegetical issues in the New Testament, to be honest with you, is you could argue that in Hebrews 8, the writer is placing weight on the variant by saying did not care for them, because that flows with the argument. But definitely in Hebrews 10, where the variant has to do with a body you have prepared for me, that's his whole point. His entire point is the variant. So it's not just, well, it was convenient to, that's what they have, and therefore it was convenient to do that. He also made a point based upon that. Right. So, that takes you into the entire huge conversation of, if you have a variant where the meaning is completely changed, then what is the original? Yeah. And what should you have as the original? And that's a program unto itself that I don't know that I could actually give a complete answer to, but it's, that argument is out there. And unfortunately, I'm one of the few people that, when preaching through Hebrews, I actually raised all these issues. I feel sorry for the poor folks at the Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church, which is where I preached that series. 85 sermons or something like that. But, they knew that was me. And so they knew that I was going to raise that kind of stuff. But I could not preach either Hebrews 8 or Hebrews 10 without mentioning that. Yeah. Because I would feel like, what if someone gets hit with that and they've heard me preach that and I didn't tell them about it? Exactly. That's where I'm weird on that one. Yeah. Yeah. And just related to Born Again, RN Steve's question here, we do have readings in the Qumran
manuscripts in the Qumran scrolls of the Old Testament that actually agree with the Septuagint.
Yes.
Like Psalm 22:16, right, James? They pierced.
I was about to bring that one up, but you beat me to it.
Yeah. So Psalm
were we separated at birth or just what? I'm not sure.
I think we were. You're a son from a different mother, maybe. I don't know. But Psalm 22:16 in the Septuagint, they pierced my hands and my feet, and the Qumran scrolls say exactly the same thing. In the Masoretic Text, instead of kari, which means to pierce, it has karu, meaning like a lion, at my hands and feet. And so I think Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trifle, was even accusing the Jews of manipulating the text to hide the Christological significance of the passage.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to refer to. And then you can find Hebrew manuscripts that had that. And so again, the point is that what we would call the Proto-Masoretic manuscript tradition was not completely unified.
That's right.
It was the Masoretes that unified it, but they unified it nearly a millennium after the time of Christ.
Right. And again, Deuteronomy 32, I think, 32, what is it, 32?
Yes.
The one about the sons of God, the Bnei Elohim. So in the King James, following the Masoretic, it says that God numbered the nations according to the tribes of the children of Israel. But in the Septuagint and the Qumran scrolls, it says God numbered the nations according to the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God. So there again, you have that agreement with Qumran,
which was thrown at me.
Yeah.
I was on KTKK radio for about 3 hours, maybe 4 hours during General Conference once.
Okay.
And my young son was with me. I think he was about 12, 13. He's about to turn 40.
Oh, yeah.
And as we were leaving our luxurious suite at Motel 6, I had a little red leather-bound Hebrew text. And I had this big book bag already. And I said, I'm going to grab it. And I stuck it in there. The last half hour, this guy calls in and he starts throwing that textual variant at me. And I was able to pull that out. Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia gives me the textual data in the footnote. So I was able to respond to him because I had that. Yeah. And then I found out afterwards that the caller was a professor from Brigham Young University, one of the heads of farms.
Okay.
And so I actually used that as an illustration when I was teaching Hebrew for Golden Gate as to why you need to learn this language.
Yeah.
If you ever find yourself discussing Mormonism in Salt Lake City on the radio, you need to be able to read the textual footnotes in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
Yeah, and I believe that was Deuteronomy 32:8.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the passage there. Right. Okay. All right. James G., thanks for the super chat. What are the earliest Hebrew texts do we currently have? Is it from Qumran?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Well, I mean, I think it's fascinating that in 2023, they found the inscriptions on, was it Mount Ebal?
Yes. Mount Ebal.
From Deuteronomy 28:29, the blessings and cursings.
Yes.
So that would go way back, way back. But those are inscriptions on stone. As far as actual manuscripts are concerned, the Qumran scrolls are pretty much our earliest. But you do have evidence of the Paleo Hebrew and inscriptions that go earlier than that. They're just not entire text.
Yeah. You have the silver amulet that has the benediction as well. So, okay. So we have just a question from Jeremy Johnson. Are you guys aware of Hadrian's anti-Jewish acts ordering the destruction of all Hebrew texts, 96 AD, and the further Hebrew text destruction up until after Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135 AD? I'm not sure if I've heard about that, James.
Well, no, I haven't either, though. Obviously, for example, when the Romans broke into Masada, that wouldn't be good for the manuscripts that were there. Any of those types of things, and certainly the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they're burning everything. So I'm sure that there was massive destruction of manuscripts and the fall of Jerusalem and all the rest of that type of stuff. But I'm not aware of a when it says Hadrian's anti-Jewish acts,
Mm-hmm.
that wouldn't shock me. But at that point, it probably would have been more of an. It's very clear that in the middle of the first century, there's confusion on the Romans' part between the Christians and the Jews in the first place.
Yeah,
that's reflected in the New Testament.
definitely.
But yeah, it'd be not difficult at all to understand how after the destruction of Jerusalem and the continuing rebellion, that there would be a rather anti-Jewish Roman perspective at that point.
Mm-hmm. Born again Christian, born again RN. Catholics claim the Cage recension added Baruch and Greek Daniel to the Septuagint to prove Jesus believed, or to the Septuagint prove Jesus believed Scripture. Doesn't this prove they weren't in Jeremiah and Daniel?
Sorry, not familiar with that one.
Yeah, not familiar with that one either. Again, just the same question. John Martignoni and Jimmy Aiken claim the Septuagint was completed before the life of Christ. JM said 134 BC. Would this be limited to the Hebrew Bible, though, not the Deuteros?
Well, I would certainly. I think it's very clear that when you say the Septuagint was completed, if what you mean by that is that somebody provided a translation. Again, I think the Pentateuch was done at one point, at one time, by a certain group. And there's just such a different level of accuracy elsewhere in it that there really wasn't a singular Septuagint, I think, until after the time of Christ. There were individual books that have been translated. I think is what we have at Qumran with what we already saw the picture of that. But the idea of a singular scroll or something like that was just the Septuagint, I think that comes later and primarily under Christian influence, because the vast majority of those manuscripts we have are not scrolls, they're codices. And Christians preferred codices. We have very, 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 very few New Testament scrolls. Almost every New Testament manuscript we have is a codex. And the vast majority of the Septuagint manuscripts we have are codex as well. So they came from Christians. So, dating stuff like that can be really challenging.
Okay, so we'll take one more question, just for the sake of time here. Let me see. There was a question here.
It's illegal to ask people over 60 years of age to do anything over an hour and a half without giving them a break.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe not in Canada, though.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to become the 51st state anyway, so.
Well, we're trying.
Hey, I'll accept it. I mean, yeah. Manifest destiny. Come on over.
If we take Greenland and Canada, we got Panama coming in, and why not?
There could be Gaza as well. So, okay, this is the last question, James. For Dr. White, should we prioritize the Septuagint readings where the apostles quote them? And there is a difference between what the apostles quote and the Masoretic Text. God bless.
So that was the last topic we were talking about that I said would require an entire program into itself, and I don't know that I could even necessarily answer the question then. It is, I think, one of the most important, one of the most challenging. I wouldn't say most important because we're only talking about a very few texts, very, very few texts, and not anything that actually ends up changing the argument of a book or something like that.
Yeah.
But in Hebrews 10, when it says a body you've prepared for me, that is the point of the author. Yeah. And so you have to deal with that variant. Yeah. And that pushes you back into, well, what Hebrew manuscripts were there? Is this an instance where the Hebrew tradition that underlied that particular translation section of the Septuagint is more faithful to the original? That gets really challenging. Really, really does.
Yeah. And so, folks, there you have it. We need to be faithful with the truth. And that's something that Dr. White and I hold in common, is we get in trouble a lot of the time for speaking the truth, even by our own brothers and sisters in Christ, who get very uncomfortable when we talk about things like the pericope adulterae, the woman caught in adultery not being part of John, or the longer ending of Mark, and so forth. But we are called, if we follow him who claims to be the truth, then truth should matter to us, and it should be optimal on our agenda. So, James, I just want to thank you, Dr. White, for joining in with us, and I appreciate your time. Always a blessing. It's always just exhilarating to talk with you and to know there's a kindred spirit out there.
Yeah, and I miss getting to do all the traveling and the conference stuff like that. I mean, I'm still doing a lot of traveling, just not the same way.
Right.
So we don't get to run into each other all that often. But that's the next generation's coming up. I'm so thankful to see the Wes Huffs out there coming along and doing their thing, and to know that us old guys, we helped get them started. So that's how it should work.
Indeed. And I know Wes Huff personally. He's doing his PhD at U of T, University of Toronto. And he's a good guy, a good brother. And we need to pass the torch on to the next generation, because this world needs the gospel, and until Christ comes again, we got to remain faithful until he comes, occupy until he comes. So so thanks again, Dr. White, and thanks again, everyone. Let me just put a quick plug in here, folks, for my book. James, you know about my book here, No King But Christ. This is a print copy. That's why you got this gray bar here, the collapse and bankruptcy of secular worldviews. So make sure you get that. There'll be a description for that in the description box. There's also going to be information in the description box for Dr. White's ministry, Alpha and Omega Ministries. You can tune in to his ministry, his YouTube channel as well. And James G, you're asking how much is that? I think US is $24.99 US. So it's on Amazon. So I'll put all that information there, folks. And thanks again. Thanks for giving up your Wednesday evening to be with us. And Dr. James, thanks again.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. God bless.
God bless you, brother. Bye for now.
All right. Bye-bye.